Good morning, everybody. My name is Dr. Sean Williams, and I am the professor of political science here at Campbellsville University, also the director of CU's program on Kentucky Heartland Institute on Public Policy. And I'm joined today by a panel of experts to have a riveting and what I'm sure is going to be exciting conversation about electoral systems. Before you click off, I promise you it's going to be a lot better than it sounds, because the three panelists who are joining to me today are experts and are actually impassioned by the problems of democracy and justice, and are here to try to either make a sales pitch to you today for why proportional representation would fix everything, or why Americans are right and Europeans are all completely wrong. Joining us today from top to bottom as they appear on my screen are three veterans of the program. Starting at the top, Landon Cameron. Landon, good morning. Welcome to the show again.
Good morning. Thank you.
Second, we have Ms. Katie Carroll, who has graciously agreed to join us once more after her riveting performance last time. Ms. Carroll, thank you very much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
And last, but of course, first in all of our hearts, Ms. Kinsey Forbes. Kinsey, thank you for joining us again on the program. Happy to see you today.
Thank you.
So let's go ahead and get started. Today we're going to be talking about proportional representation and why proportional representation works for some countries, and maybe why it would work for us or why it might not work for us. We're not entirely sure. So to get us started, somebody jump in there and just kind of explain for the audience at home, when I say proportional representation, what exactly am I talking about?
So proportional representation is an electoral system that actually a majority of the democracies around the world use. It has different variations of how it works, but its main goal is to provide a more accurate representation in the legislature of the actual constituencies that those Congress people are representing. And the U.S. does not use it. They use a single member district. They do not use proportional representation.
When you say a more accurate system of representation, accurate how? What do you mean by accuracy?
So proportional representation, they usually have more people within one seat representing one constituency, like one group. So usually they have more women in their legislatures. They have parties that maybe are smaller, but they represent more minority populations. So it just kind of paints an overall picture of who they're representing. That's the goal, at least, for proportional representation.
Mr. Cameron, so Ms. Carroll had said that we don't use it. We use something called a single member district system. What does that mean? And how is it somehow different from the prop rep system we're going to talk about today?
Yeah, so the United States mainly uses a plurality single member district system, which means that one person is elected per district, and each district is supposed to have roughly the same amount of people, and whoever gets the most votes, no matter whether it's a majority or not, wins that seat. There are some examples of some states, such as Maine and Alaska, that use a ranked choice voting, which can be described as a sort of proportional representation, though it's not used in its pure form in the United States.
Ranked choice voting.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean?
So a voter would receive a ballot with the name of every candidate on it, and they would rank their choice from first to last. And if their first choice receives the least amount of votes in the first tabulation, that choice would be eliminated, and that person's vote would be transferred to their second choice, and so on until a candidate receives a majority of the vote.
That sounds really similar to what some other viewers may have observed whenever the House of Representatives had their last speaker vote. And of course, at the time of this filming, the House of Representatives is getting ready to have another speaker vote. And so it may very well see the exact same thing. But in that vote, you had 15 rounds of voting where basically a bunch of names were put forward. And if nobody won, we just keep tabulating. And so you're saying that with this single ranked voting transferable system, that they only have to vote once and their votes are automatically moved over?
Yes, correct.
That sounds pretty interesting. So why would a nation pick the proportional representation system that Ms. Carroll described as opposed to one of the other two systems that you described? Kinsey, we'll go ahead and let you jump in on that one. Why proportional representation?
Proportional representation gives a, well, kind of like it sounds, more representation for minority groups versus the single member district that is kind of, I mean, sometimes they call it like the winner takes all system. So with a proportional representation, you are getting equal representation for multiple different groups versus just a one person representing one group of people elected that way.
Okay, but why would I want that? And I don't mean to sound like, you know, having people represented is a bad thing, but it seems like having more people in Congress. Like we have two political parties in the House of Representatives is an absolute disaster right now, right? It seems like if we were to add 3 or 4 political parties to the House of Representatives, it doesn't make things any better. Why would a country advocate for having more minority voices as opposed to fewer minority voices in governance?
I think one of the reasons, well, research actually shows that voters are more satisfied with a proportional representation electoral system because they feel like their vote isn't wasted. They feel as though, such as, you know, a ranked choice type of voting, where, you know, they number who they want to have go into a seat. If the first person doesn't win, it goes to the second vote. So no matter what, voters feel like they have a say in who's getting elected, and they don't feel like, oh, well, my vote's going to waste and there's no point in doing that, so why would I vote again?
Does increased satisfaction have any positive benefits to a political system, or is it just, hey, people are happier?
I think so, because if there's increased satisfaction, then there's a possibility for increased participation and people actually wanting to be involved in politics and in the voting system, which I think is an important part of living in a democracy, because voting is a great right and privilege that we all get to do, to participate in the political system.
And that's actually been a problem, I guess, of the American political system up until the 2016 and 2020 campaigns. Voter turnout in the United States has been low compared to most of our fellow democratic countries. And you were saying that we're kind of in the minority in having a democratic system. Are there any other reasons why, other than these ideas of voter satisfaction, that having more minority voices might be a good thing, or having more political parties is better than having few?
One thing that I would add, it sort of builds off of what Katie was saying, but allowing more minority voices and allowing voters to be able to vote for a minority party. You often hear in U.S. elections of people saying they had to choose the lesser of two evils. That is a characteristic of our single member district system, plurality system, where you have to vote for one of the two major parties, or else you may not have an influence or a say in the election. So using a system of proportional representation would allow voters to be able to vote for these minority parties and having that vote count as something in the end result.
That's interesting, because if you think about our current election cycle, so this is probably true in 2016, but I think this is absolutely true in 2020. I would bet that a majority of Americans would rather have neither Joe Biden or Donald Trump to be the next president of the United States. And I could be wrong on that, but there's no real effective third option because there's no real third party. And so you're suggesting that in this system, it would be easier to have a third alternative, something other than Joe Biden and Donald Trump. I wonder, would the two major political parties pick different candidates if they knew that there was a third choice out there for the voters? That would be That'd be something that'd probably be interesting to find out. Okay, so a little bit about what's good about proportional representation, and yet we don't use it in the United States. We in Great Britain, and I think most Latin American countries, the kind of older democracies, the ones that were founded before maybe 1860, we all use what you guys were calling the single member district. Why do we use that instead of this other version that gives us more choice, more voice? It'd be a great book title.
Well, I think one of the downfalls to proportional representation, which could be a factor of why we don't use it, is okay. So with proportional representation, because there's so many different, there could be different parties, multiple different parties in a legislature, like a parliament or something. They have to create coalitions to get things passed, to group together and have a majority to get a certain bill passed. But a downfall to that is stuff doesn't get done as quickly. So these groups have to band together to pass things, and sometimes they don't always agree, and they may pass legislation less efficiently than a country that uses single member district.
Again, coming from the current American perspective, is it that different than what we're seeing now? If I'm just looking at efficiency of legislation, we're now 10 days post-budget deadline. And the only way that the government was able to stay open was to fire the Speaker of the House of Representatives. How worried should I be about proportional representation leading to this problem of slower political systems? I mean, the Senate took a week off, right? Like, this is kind of ironic. Like, we don't have a budget. The House of Representatives is falling apart, and the Senate just decided to take a vacation for a week because they knew that being in town would be a waste of time. Is there anything else you got that leads me to think that single member districts would be better than proportional representation, than just it's slower?
Now, I didn't say that single member districts weren't slow too. Just maybe they have moments where they're not as slow.
Yeah, that's fair.
I think that comes down to more of a quirk with our governmental system of using the system we have now instead of a parliamentary system, which tends to be more efficient in producing legislation because a parliamentary system doesn't have a separately elected president. And so you always have a united government, whereas now in the United States, where you have a separately elected Congress and a separately elected president, you can have a disjointed government, which often has difficulties in passing legislation because they simply don't agree.
It's an interesting argument. So then by your measure, the problem with our House as opposed to a parliament isn't so much that they're disheveled in the House of Representatives. It's that the House of Representatives has to compete or contend with the Senate and the president, who are both Democratic. Is that your argument?
I think that's a major point of it. Also, to the narrowness of the Republican majority and their overall party disunity also plays a role. But
yeah, if we were a parliamentary system, we wouldn't be waiting for the House to pick a speaker. We'd be holding a new general election.
Yes,
which would give us as voters an opportunity. But again, that's a different podcast. That's parliamentary versus presidential systems as opposed to the proportional representation. So something else that I've heard about with conversations over political proportional representation is that prop rep systems have a greater tendency for extremism. And in fact, as we're looking at Poland, or as we're looking at the Czech Republic, or even Austria, we see examples, maybe even, this is a bad example, but in those three countries, we're seeing examples of kind of right-wing extremist parties that have very narrow minorities, so they don't even have a majority of the seats, and yet they have found themselves either leading or as part of a governing coalition. Is the concern over extremism in proportional representation systems real? And how would that work? Why would we have to worry about extremism?
Yeah, I do think that's a very real concern with the proportional representation system, that comes with allowing minority parties to have a voice in parliament or the legislature. Most electoral systems try to stave that off by using what is called an electoral threshold or a minimum threshold, where a party has to receive, for example, 5% of the vote before they can receive any seats in parliament. But obviously, as right-wing parties around the globe rise in public support, that is no longer keeping them out of parliament. And like you mentioned, part of what is called party fractionalization or parliamentary fractionalization with a proportional representation system where parties get smaller and smaller and smaller, and you have to have more members, more parties to form a majority coalition. You increase the chances of, say, traditional right-wing or center-right parties having to rely on right-wing parties to form a majority coalition and have those parties join government.
Some people even argue that this has been a problem in Israel right now, that Israel uses something like a proportional representation system. However, their voter threshold is something like 1% or something really, really, really small, which effectively means they have 15 or 16 political parties that are part of the Knesset. And there's no way that any one political party is going to gain sufficient control that they don't have to either lean far to the right or lean far to the left. Do you think if the United States were to adopt something like a proportional representation system, would we be plagued with the problem of partisan extremism and the rise of far right or far left parties? Or do you think that our system is much more moderate than Europe and we would be fine?
I think we definitely run the risk of that happening because we're already seeing issues with far right leaders rising up and slowly gaining power, but they are gaining power.
Ms. Forbes, you've been quiet for a while. What do you think? Do you think we have a fear or concern over extremism in America?
I do. I think that kind of like what Katie was saying, you run the risk of having that group that will rise up and try to take control and just be, like you were saying, how we're seeing in Israel. We do run the risk of that in the United States as well, I feel like personally.
Is it only far right? If you listen to the narrative coming out of sort of center-right media, their argument is that the reason why Hillary Clinton lost the election in 2016 is because Bernie Sanders scared people. That especially in Florida, and if Hillary Clinton had won Florida, she'd have won the presidential election. That people in Florida were so afraid of the left wing of the Democratic Party being communist or socialist that they held Hillary Clinton accountable for that. Do you think that we would be concerned about a left wing forming a far left political party in America? Or is our country more center right, and therefore our fears are more about right wing parties?
I wouldn't be as worried about far left extremism because a lot of people that are worried about far left extremism are worried about everybody having rights and equal opportunity and a living wage. And if that's extreme to people, then yeah, maybe we'll see far left extremism. But I would argue that actual far left extremism isn't really a problem, especially compared to right-wing extremism or borderline extremism that we have been seeing.
Would you guys agree?
I think like you were saying earlier with the current situation in the House of Representatives, I think we have seen maybe not so much about whether left-wing parties will come to power, but how they will exercise that power. I think it is much more common for far-right parties to be bomb throwers or use a strategy of burn it all down and tend to use their power to disrupt the system rather than try to actually govern.
I agree with both of them. I was going to say something similar to what Landon said. and kind of what Katie was saying, you know, your far left is more of like your equal opportunity, advocating for people who may not want to speak for themselves. And then your far right is your more hardcore, we'll go to war side of it. So
here we have our far left, about as far left as our political parties get is a union strike in California. Y'all may be right. I want to come back to an observation that Landon had a second ago and think through another question about proportional representation. One concern that I've heard is about this thing called stability. That in a prop rep system, if you have these small parties that have to form coalitions, that they're more likely to fall apart. Is that a legitimate concern? And because we're a presidential system, is that a concern that we would need to be worried about?
I don't think we would have to worry as much as other countries because, like you said, we would have a presidential system and the president is responsible for things that usually come up suddenly, such as foreign policy. But we would have to be concerned because the House of Representatives is responsible for appropriations or budgeting and stuff like that. So that has always been one of the downsides, or one of the spoken downsides of proportional representation, is that it can cause governmental instability. A coalition, if that is formed, could fall apart at any minute. And that's not something that we currently have to worry about, where we have fixed elections every 2 years with two major parties that one of them holds a majority no matter what.
Yeah, we would definitely need to do something about that whole don't pass a budget, the government shuts down thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think we're legitimately, in all seriousness, I think we're the only country in the world that has a rule that says that if you don't reappropriate funds, the government just stops functioning. We may be the only one. So we're running a little bit closer out of time. So I guess one more question. I'm just going to kind of go around the table and let each of y'all address this if you want to. Well, you have no choice. Given the differences between proportional representation, single member district, and what you guys called ranked choice voting or the single transferable vote, do you think that the United States is better off with what we have now? Or do you think that for the House at least, or maybe also for the Senate, that we should consider going with some other option? Kenzie, let's go ahead and start with you. What do you think?
I think that, I honestly think that proportional representation would be a better ideology, like a better one to adopt. Just because it does allow for that, wider variety of views to be heard and considered. And with just looking at how our government is now, the single member district hasn't always been the greatest in my opinion, and I feel like proportional representation may just be a little better.
Ms. Carroll, what do you think? Do you think a change would do us good?
I agree with Kinsey. I think that if the U.S. kept their system that they have now, I think we can make it work, and we've been making it work for the last, 250 years or so. But I think it'd be interesting to see how the U.S. would handle proportional representation, at least in the House or the Senate or both. And I think that it could do some good. I think that people would probably enjoy seeing more representation within their own Congress and things that they care about being brought up more than it has been.
Mr. Cameron, you get the final word.
Similar sentiments as what the others have expressed. I think within our current system, as it's written in the Constitution, I'm not sure that proportional representation would simply be possible. I do think that, as we mentioned, ranked choice voting would be a good reform to add some of those characteristics.
I think it'd be interesting to see. One of the advantages that we have over some of our parliamentary friends is that we operate under a federal system. I think it'd be very interesting to see what would happen if some of our, especially larger states like New York or California, Texas, Florida, if they were to adopt a proportional representation system to get a sense of the effect that it would have at the state level, and especially in our ethnically or religiously diverse states. So we might get a sense of what it might look like if we went on a national level. Well, thank you everybody at home who decided to join us, whether you decided to join us live or in Memorex, and you're catching this later on YouTube or Facebook. We greatly appreciate it. Join us next time. We're going to be having an interesting discussion that has been sparked because of one of the positions of a Republican presidential candidate, where the Republican Party is now considering advocating taking away the right to vote for people under the age of 25. And so we're going to be next week discussing whether or not there is this brewing conflict between Gen Z and the Republican Party, and if there is, why that might be the case. But until then, goodbye and God bless.